Now, just like with my Wonka review, I want to keep this as brief as possible. But the Beekeeper, let's just say I went in with no expectations. I was expecting, it's January, and like most January movies, this tends to be the dumping ground of just, you either get a crappy horror movie or just a forgettable generic action flick. The Beekeeper, I went in expecting just your generic action flick, and boy was I wrong with this being a generic action flick. Now, to most people, obviously, they're gonna see a generic action flick, but for me, I didn't see it. I had a I really like this movie a lot. I I mean, don't get me wrong, there are a ton of problems with this movie. I think it does take itself too seriously at times. I do think, take now take the villains for example. I'm going to jump straight into this review with the villains. The villains, Josh Hutcherson and a bunch of others, I don't want to spoil too much, but Josh Hutcherson in particular, who is primarily a main villain, he's not given a whole lot of depth here. And you don't, in a movie like this, you're not expecting like a great backstory out of him. But, he is just your atypical young, drug, idealistic, you know, villain who is just wealthy as all get out, does all kinds of drugs that he can get his hands on, and just does not give a rat's ass as long as he gets money. That's all he is. He plays that part well, don't get me wrong, but that's pretty. It's pretty bland, I'm not gonna lie. But with that being said, the action of this film is just flat out spectacular. I mean, do I even need to explain how awesome the action is? It's essentially like John Wick. Now, the more I thought about it, now I think this is up there with John Wick, to be quite honest. Just in terms of, like, obviously it borrows a lot from John Wick, being a revenge story. If you've seen the trailer, you know how the whole thing starts. And going into this movie, you're probably expecting, either a so bad it's good or just a bad, forgettable action movie. To be fair, it's neither. Thankfully, it's neither. But it is kind of, silly in that aspect. But if you've watched the trailer, you would know what to expect. Jason Statham's character is going to get revenge. Had a popcorn kernel in my mouth there. It's going to get revenge on the people that done wrong to a bunch of people. And when it reached someone that he cared about, he then takes matters into his own hands, essentially. And boy, does he absolutely kick ass in this movie. In fact, that's an understatement. Now, like I said, this borrows heavily from John Wick. Like, you're watching this and you're thinking, this is like every John Wick, except the fight sequences, they don't feel choreographed like John Wick. And also, I'll get into this in just a little bit, but also with the shaky cam. I'm going to get into this now, screw it, I'm not going to wait on it. But the shaky cam. You take something like John Wick, there's not a whole lot of shaky cam. The camera's very steady, it's very fluid, and again, the action's very choreographed. With this, it's very shaky. It's very, it's a bit of rough around the edges, I guess you could say, where, people are just tossing, throwing, and, throwing punches, and the action's kind of cut all the hell. It's a bit jagged at times, but it's still nonetheless badass because, let's be fair, Jason Statham kicking ass, it's what you came to see, and that's what you get. And boy, do the action scenes deliver. Now, I'm going to talk about John Wick just for a little bit here. But with John Wick, don't get me wrong, it's a near perfect franchise in my eyes. But I do feel like with John Wick, the action scenes, particularly with the third and fourth installment, although those are two very fantastic movies that I will eventually get to, the action feels very long and exhausting. by the end you're exhausted because just so much has taken place. With this movie, with the Beekeeper's action, it doesn't have a whole lot of action. This movie, granted, this movie's very fast paced. It's a very quick movie. This movie, you're in and out within hour 40 minutes. It's honestly amazing. We don't get a whole lot of movies like that anymore. I guarantee you, if you know any other studio made this, they would have made a 2.5 hour movie if they could. And don't get me wrong, I wouldn't mind seeing Jason Statham kick ass for another hour, but you know, I really like how tight this movie is, just in terms of being short. And it keeps the action at a minimum. It delivers enough action where it doesn't feel too short or too long. It feels like the right required amount of time. And because it's so quick and it's, to the point, you don't have any type of issue with it just kind of cutting back to other characters. And that's what I also want to get into. The characters in this film, particularly, near the beginning with, Jason Statham and I forgot her name, but his the person he takes care of with the bees and everything. It sets him up well enough to give you an idea of who this person is and why they care about each other and just how long they've been working. Like, you don't get a sense of like, okay, these are two actors getting the material of like, oh, they've known each other for many years. This movie, in just a few amounts of screen time with these two characters before her unfortunate death, they make it feel like they've been friends for years. And that's what I like. You get to care about the characters, particularly with the FBI agent Veronica. Now I want to talk about her for just a quick second. Now, in the trailer, you're probably thinking, again, it's your generic action January flick where it's just going to go straight into, okay, Jason Statham's going to kill a bunch of people and the FBI's going to, investigate this. It does do that, but this character Veronica in particular, she is involved with this because she is related to the victim that ultimately passed away. And before Jason Statham just absolutely beats ass in the movie, you get a sit down moment with them. You get they just talk about their lives. It's a big exposition dump essentially, but it works well in the film. It works well enough for me, at least. And again, you get a sense of like, you care about the characters. You care about each and every story. Like, when it cuts back and forth between, the villains of the story. I don't want to get too deep into that because, again, I really highly recommend seeing this film, especially in IMAX. I'll get more into the conclusion with that later, but with the characters specifically, no character feels too shallow or too boring to really, like you just don't care. You want to go back to the action. Now, granted, yes, this is just my humble opinion. Everyone's different. I guarantee you a lot of people watching this review and maybe want to watch this movie are probably going to go like, no, I want to see Jason Statham kick ass. I mean, who doesn't? He's pretty fucking good at it. But, there's not a whole lot of action here. But the action that is there, it's very well worth your time and investment. And it's, awesome enough that it keeps you hooked. Like, the story keeps you hooked. The characters keep you hooked. You want to see what happens. And again, you just want to see Jason Statham just absolutely beat ass. And you know what? That's really the biggest praise I can give this film, is essentially, you're not going into this movie expecting, complex characters or a complex story or even like worthwhile story. You're just expecting a fun, entertaining movie. This is what you get. A fun, action-packed, sort of silly movie that you think is going to be, oh, this is going to be so bad it's good or so bad it's bad. This movie is unironically good. I really liked it, particularly near the end. The end is where it just kicks. It takes all the action scenes from the previous parts of the film and just dials it up to an 11 for a relatively short climax, but still engaging and thrilling enough and gripping. It's so much fun seeing this. And I highly recommend seeing this in an IMAX theater like I just did. Me and a buddy of mine from class watched this movie in theaters, and this was the first time I took him to the IMAX theater in our town. He likes IMAX, even though I like IMAX more. He prefers like the Cinemark XD theater and the MXL theater like at the other Metrolux we have in town. But for me personally, if you have an IMAX and can afford it, go see it in IMAX because my god, hearing those punches on the and the music going, it's tons of fun. It's a very fun watch. Again, not everyone's going to love this movie. I'm just speaking for me. It's subjective. You can like certain things. I like this film personally. I really did like this film. You can watch this film and not get the same out of it like I did. You could think that, oh, it wasn't enough action or the characters were boring and shallow. That is okay. I'm fine with that. I could care less. It's your opinion, and this is my opinion. I thought the movie was pretty freaking cool. So, big surprise considering that, again, January tends to be the dumping ground of a lot of not so good movies. But this marks 3 years in a row for me where there are three genuinely good January movies that came out. Excuse me. So, the first one, I'll mention this real quick before I end it. The first one, Scream 5. I'll review it eventually, but I found it pretty enjoyable and a surprising movie of the year, considering that I didn't have high expectations for it. The second, 2023, Megan. Again, I will get to that movie and I will explain why I like that film. I know a lot of people have issues with it, but me personally, I thought it was a big surprise of the year. And now, starting 2024 with The Beekeeper, being an action flick that would normally, in another world, be the most forgettable action flick of the year, just the most forgettable trash film you could think of seeing, turns out to be surprisingly good, in my humble opinion. Anyway, I just wanted to keep this review brief as possible. I know it's like 13 minutes, but you know what? I really enjoyed this film. I highly recommend it, surprisingly. And because I went in with this film with very low expectations, no expectations at all, expecting a silly, fun, bad movie. Instead, what I got out of it, a pretty fun movie in the process. Anyway, that's about it. See ya.